In the sweltering July of 2002, a senior operations director for the Central Intelligence Directorate named Samuel Vance sat in a windowless, pressurized briefing room deep within the concrete heart of the Citadel in Northern Virginia. He was 53 years old, a man whose face was a roadmap of the late Cold War. He had 26 years of institutional weight behind him. He had overseen the destabilization of regimes in the Levant, managed the Gladio residue in the Balkans, and coordinated the paramilitary surges in the Horn of Africa. He was a believer in the American century, and he had just been informed that a team of intelligence officers from the British Crown Group would be embedded into his command architecture for the imminent invasion of the Mesopotamian basin. Vance's reaction was not one of professional cooperation, it was a visceral rejection. His words, captured on the internal audio logs by two separate aides, were a testament to the arrogance of a superpower at its zenith. "Get those British ghosts out of my theater." He didn't hesitate. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed that if a problem couldn't be solved with a billion-dollar satellite array or a suitcase full of $100 bills, it wasn't a problem worth solving. To Vance, the British were legacy operators, theatrical, underfunded, and hopelessly romantic about their special relationships with local tribal elders. He remembered working with the Crown's secret intelligence branch in Beirut during the 80s. He found them to be reckless amateurs who spent more time in tea houses than in secure facilities. He had crossed paths with their special reconnaissance teams in the mountains of Bosnia and dismissed them as aggressive cowboys whose tactics were a century out of date. Samuel Vance believed, with a religious fervor that had never been truly shattered, that the Mesopotamian campaign would be the ultimate vindication of full-spectrum intelligence. He was about to embark on the most expensive intelligence disaster of the modern era. What unfolded over the next 3 years in the southern marshes and port cities of the region would do more than just prove Vance wrong. It would reveal a tectonic gap between the Directorate's philosophy of data acquisition and the Crown's philosophy of human intimacy. While the Americans were trying to buy the war, the British were busy thinking their way through it. The Crown's operatives didn't just contribute, they conducted a masterclass in the art of the ghost. In the cities of Al-Basra, Al-Amara, and the strategic nodes along the Shat al-Arab, the British ran circles around the citadel. They identified threats the satellites missed. They recruited the unreachables. They built human networks that didn't just survive the collapse of the occupation, they thrived within it. And they did it with 1/10 of the budget, a fraction of the hardware, and an institutional vibe that left their American counterparts asking, with a mixture of resentment and awe, how? To understand the failure of Samuel Vance, you first have to understand the machine he built. In late 2001, the Directorate's Mesopotamia Task Force was expanded into an industrial-scale intelligence factory. The model was simple. Money is the ultimate force multiplier. The American approach to human intelligence, HUMINT, relied on 3 pillars: cash, high-bandwidth digital connectivity, and a reliance on Exile Proxies. Between 1995 and 2002, the Directorate funneled an estimated $120 million into opposition groups living in luxury hotels in London and Washington. The primary proxy was a man named Victor Solano, leader of the Mesopotamian National Alliance. Solano's organization alone received $35 million in direct payments. The Directorate believed that Solano's people were thinking insurgents, who would provide the coordinates for weapons of mass destruction, the locations of the regime's Praetorian Corps, and the keys to the city's administrative heart. The British took the austerity path. The Crown's Mesopotamia section, known internally as the Oriental Desk, had maintained a quiet, skeletal presence in the region since 1991. While the Americans were throwing gold at exiles,
The British were cultivating a handful of biological sensors inside the regime itself. This was the difference of the craft. The American exile networks produced a mountain of data that was, as the 2004 internal audit would later describe, a landscape of fabrication. The sources were telling Vance exactly what he wanted to hear to GD flowing. Meanwhile, the Crown's internal sources, fewer than 10 individuals, were providing data that the Joint Intelligence Board in GD rated as high fidelity. One specific Crown source, codenamed Vanguard, had GD regime's logistics core since 1998. While the $100 million American program was hallucinating mobile biological labs, a single British officer running Vanguard from a safe house in GD run producing the exact movement patterns of the regime's heavy armor. Vanguard provided more actionable tactical data GD. Samuel Vance didn't know Vanguard existed. He didn't want to know. To him, the British were just lunatics playing at being Lawrence of Arabia. The British force that arrived in the southern marshes in early 2003 was not a ceremonial unit.
It was a fused entity of professionals drawn from the Secret Intelligence Branch, Defense Analytics, and most importantly, the Special Reconnaissance Element, SRE. The SRE was the ghost in the machine, a unit so restricted that the British government refused to acknowledge its existence for decades. The SRE had been forged in the urban abyss of Northern Ireland. For 30 years, its operators had lived undercover in the most hostile sectarian environments in Europe. They were the masters of the grey space. These were not desk-bound analysts. These were men and women who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the walk past, a technique where an operator could assess a target house, identify the concealed guards, and map the internal structure in a single 90-second casual stroll. They understood social geography. They knew that in a city like Al-Basra, intelligence is not about what you hear on a satellite phone. It is about who the shopkeeper's cousin is. They understood tribal dynamics not as a lecture in a classroom at the farm, but as a living, breathing, reflexive system. The directorate officers in the southern sector had none of this species awareness. Most of them were on their first hot deployment. Many spoke only through translators. Their training had taught them how to recruit a diplomat in a 5-star hotel in Geneva, not how to run an agent in a slum where a single anomaly in your behavior meant a bullet in the back of the head. When the first American team set up in Al-Basra in May 2003, they did what the machine always does. They built a fortress. They set up in a massive concrete palace surrounded by blast walls and armed guards. They communicated with potential sources through intermediaries. They relied on SIGINT, signals intelligence, piped down from the NSA's massive regional hubs. In the memorable words of one Crown officer, the Americans were trying to understand a street fight by watching the heat signatures of the participants from space. Samuel Vance's dismissal of the British Lunatics would be the first thing he remembered when the Al-Basra station started sending its reports back to Virginia in June 2003. The British had been on the ground for only 8 weeks. In that time, the combined SRE and intelligence branch team, operating under the shadow designation Operation Catalyst, had achieved what the Directorate's massive apparatus had failed to do in years of preparation. They had successfully badged and recruited 11 primary sources within the emerging sectarian militias that were filling the vacuum left by the regime's collapse. 11 residue sources in 8 weeks. In the same period, the American Basra station, with 4 times the personnel and an unlimited incentive fund, had recruited 2. One of those 2 was later discovered to be a double agent feeding the machine invented locations for weapons caches to lure American patrols into IED traps. The British method was aggressively austere. The Crown officers didn't stay behind the blast walls. They took off their uniforms. They put on local clothing.
They sat in the tea houses. They attended the funerals of local leaders. They learned the names of the children. They did this on foot, sometimes with nothing but a concealed 9mm and a burst comm device the size of a pack of cigarettes. One Crown officer, known in the residue of classified logs as Caleb, reportedly spent 3 weeks living in a single room above a butcher shop in one of the most denied sectors of the city. He ate the local rice, he breathed the coal smoke, and he built a biological trust with a middle-ranking commander of the local resistance.
That relationship would eventually produce the intelligence that prevented the destruction of the British headquarters in a massive coordinated suicide attack. The Directorate viewed this as unacceptable risk. They sent a classified cable to Langley in July 2003, describing British methods as reckless, amateurish, and inconsistent with established security protocols for denied areas. The cable recommended that the British Lunatics be excluded from joint intelligence sharing unless they adopted the American standard. The British response, delivered through their liaison in Washington, was a masterpiece of Hereford arrogance. We note your concerns. We also note that we have the names of the men building your bombs, and you do not. We respectfully suggest that your concerns would carry more weight if you were producing results. That exchange, dry and lethal, defined the war for the next 3 years. The machine was looking for data. The species was looking for the truth. Samuel Vance sat in his office, looking at the full-spectrum dominance map of Iraq. It was glowing with blue icons and digital certainty, but in the southern port, a different map was being drawn with pencil and string, a map of families, of debts, of vibes, and of ghosts. The machine was blind, and the ghosts were already through the door. By the autumn of 2003, the vibe of southern Iraq had undergone a lethal metamorphosis. The initial euphoria of the regime's collapse had evaporated, replaced by a stagnant humidity of insurgency. The city of al-Basra, once the Venice of the East, was now a labyrinth of sectarian fault lines, where the sewage-choked canals acted as tactical shadows for a new kind of predator. The American Directorate, operating from their air-conditioned palace in Virginia, viewed the South as a managed sector. They saw a Shia population that was supposedly pro-coalition. Samuel Vance, the director of the Mesopotamia Task Force, sat in his office at the Citadel, looking at the thermal maps provided by the machine. The drones showed a city in motion. The signal's intercepts showed a population busy with commerce. To Vance, the war was a series of data points that suggested stability. But 3,000 miles away, in the dust-choked alleys of Al-Amara, a 4-person team from the British Special Reconnaissance Element, SRE, was sensing a different reality. They weren't looking at data. They were looking at residue. To understand why the SRE was able to see what the Directorate missed, you have to understand the alchemy of the shadow, the institutional DNA of a unit that spent 30 years in the urban abyss of Northern Ireland. The SRE was the evolution of a ghost unit known as the Det. Its operators had been selected not for their ability to carry 100 pounds over a mountain, but for their ability to vanish in a crowd. While the American Tier 1 units, Delta and the SEALs, were masters of the high-velocity breach, the SRE were the masters of the austerity of the observation. Their training was a systematic destruction of the soldier's ego. They learned to sit in a scrape, a concealed hole in a wall or a hollowed-out van, for 72 hours at a time. They learned the reflexive observation, a biological tuning that allowed them to detect a target's presence by the subtle change in the acoustic vibe of a street. The SRE operators in Al-Basra and Al-Amara brought with them a technique known as the Belfast Walk Past. In the American system, reconnaissance is a platform-driven exercise. You put a drone over the house.
You use a thermal sensor to count the heartbeats.
But in the SRE world, you use human intimacy. An operator, dressed in the tattered acrylic sweater of a local dock worker, would walk casually past a high-threat node, a house suspected of harboring an insurgent cell. In that 90-second pass, the operator's brain would conduct a surgical scan. They didn't look at the door, they sensed the tension of the hinges. They didn't look for weapons, they looked for the residue of guard duty. The way a young man on a corner held his hands, the specific rhythm of a curtain being pulled back, the smell of industrial-grade grease coming from a domestic kitchen. By September 2003, the SRE had identified an anomaly in the matrix that the Directorate's $40 million intelligence fusion cell in Balad had completely ignored. They had tracked a movement pattern originating from the Iranian border crossing at Shalamche. It wasn't a troop movement, it was a logistical whisper. A series of unmarked local trucks were moving from the border into a disused date processing factory south of Alamara. The machine at Langley dismissed this as cross-border smuggling of domestic goods. The Directorate's analysts, who had never stood in an Iraqi tea house, concluded that the smugglers were merely moving flour and cooking oil. But Caleb, the Crown Intelligence officer we encountered in Part 1, had a source, a thinking local who worked at the factory. The source didn't report flour. He reported liners. Specifically, he reported copper and tantalum discs, machined with a precision that was state level. In the Hereford world, this was a binary trigger. Caleb knew that you don't use high-purity tantalum to make cooking pots. You use it to make EFPs, explosively formed penetrators. The EFP was the nightmare of the armor. It was a specialized shaped charge that, upon detonation, turned a metal disc into a molten slug of hypervelocity iron. It was designed to travel at 2 kilometers per second, fast enough to punch through the side of an American M1 Abrams tank or a British Challenger 2 as if they were made of paper. The SRE team in Alamara launched Operation Spectre Zero to map the network. This was a masterclass in tactical austerity. They didn't use helicopters. They didn't use the loud, armored Stryker vehicles the Americans favored. Instead, they used Q cars. The Q car was the SRE's primary tool. On the outside, it was a rusted, dented Opel or a white Toyota Hiace van, the background noise of Mesopotamia. But inside, these vehicles were monsters of deception. The mechanics in the British station had stripped the original engines and replaced them with high-torque blocks from luxury European sedans. They had reinforced the suspension to handle high-speed J-turns in the narrow alleys. They had installed hidden Kevlar panels in the doors and fitted burst-com antennas inside the upholstery. The SRE operators, men and women, operated as couples. A male and female operator in a beat-up sedan would sit in a 2-hour traffic jam in Alamara, looking like a husband and wife arguing. They were 3 meters away from the high-threat node. While the American Directorate was waiting for a satellite to pass over, the British ghosts were recording the faces of the Iranian handlers through a pinhole camera hidden in a grocery bag. For 11 days, the SRE tracked the liner smuggling route. They identified 19 primary nodes in the network. They traced the financing back to a specific cell in Tehran, Unit 1000 of the Quds Force. Caleb drafted a high-fidelity assessment and shared it with Samuel Vance's team at the Directorate. The report was surgical. It provided the coordinates of the factory, the names of the 19 facilitators, and a technical warning that a new, lethal threat to coalition armor was now operational. Vance's response was recorded in an internal memo that would later be used against him in the 2009 inquiry. He called the British report anecdotal,
over-reliant on human sourcing, and lacking technical verification. "The British lunatics are chasing ghosts again," Vance reportedly told his staff. "They're using their Northern Ireland lore to hallucinate an Iranian conspiracy. We have no SIGINT, signals intelligence, suggesting EFPs are in the theater. If the Iranians were moving state-level tech, our satellites would see the thermal signatures of the machining plants. The British source is likely a fabricator looking for a payday." This was the trap of the machine. Vance believed that if the Directorate couldn't see it with a $200 million sensor, it didn't exist. He had forgotten the binary truth of the Mesopotamian basin. The most dangerous things happen in the shadow of the signal. The SRE commander in Al-Basra was furious. "We are giving them the chemistry of the end," he reportedly told Caleb, "and they're rejecting it because it wasn't delivered in a PowerPoint by a drone pilot." The British decided to abstain from the hierarchy. They realized they couldn't convince the machine, so they began to fight the war of the ghost on their own. They started to conduct surgical snatches, taking the low-level facilitators of the EFP network off the streets one by one, using their Q cars and their civilian-clothed, thinking soldiers. But they were too few, and the machine was too large. On a cold morning in December 2003, the mirage of stability was shattered. A British Army Land Rover, part of a routine patrol near the outskirts of Al Amara, was moving through a narrow canyon of houses. The machine at Balad had cleared the route.
The satellite feed showed 0 anomalies. The thermal drone reported all clear. Suddenly, a device hidden inside a discarded television set on the roadside detonated. It wasn't a standard IED. It didn't produce a massive explosion of dirt and fire. It produced a silent ultrasonic tear. A molten slug of copper, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound, cut through the Land Rover's door, passed through the driver, and exited through the engine block, disabling the vehicle instantly. 1 British soldier was killed instantly. 2 others were maimed by the spall of the armor. The device was an EFP. It was the exact weapon Caleb had warned about in September. It had been manufactured with the liners from the factory the SRE had mapped. The attack was carried out by a cell led by 2 of the 19 men the British had identified. Men the Directorate had refused to target because they were SIGINT negative. The fallout at Langley was a cathedral of silence. Samuel Vance sat in his office, looking at the forensic report from the wreckage. The copper liner bore the biological signature of a machining plant in Isfahan. It was state level. It was Iranian. It was exactly what the British lunatics had said it was. The difference of the craft was now measured in blood. The Directorate's machine had failed the first great test of the Iraq insurgency. They had the billions, they had the satellites, and they had the full spectrum dominance. But they didn't have the vibe. They didn't have the residue. And they certainly didn't have the thinking soldier who could sit in a tea house and hear the sound of the machine before it even started. Vance realized that the British ghosts weren't reckless cowboys. They were a different species. They were the only ones who actually understood that in Mesopotamia, the digital truth is a lie, and the human truth is the only thing that doesn't run out of batteries. But Vance was an organization man. He couldn't admit he was wrong. He decided to double down. He requested another $100 million for technical sensors. He wanted more drones. He wanted to digitalize the marshes. He was going to try to build a better machine to catch a faster ghost. It was a decision that would lead directly to the crisis of 2004, the year the southern Iraq sector would burn, and the year the British method would become the only thing standing between the coalition and a total systemic collapse. Part 2 of the Shadow War is the story of the validation of the eye. It is the story of how 3 decades of Belfast reign prepared a unit for the dust of Iraq. It is the story of why you don't ignore the thinking soldier. Because by the time the machine sees the threat, the ghost has already been through the door. And in the marshes of the south, the ghosts were just getting started. By the spring of 2004, the city of Al-Basra was a masterpiece of optical deception. To the American Directorate and the provisional administrators in the Green Zone, the southern capital was a success story of nation building. They looked at the spreadsheets provided by the machine and saw progress. 14,000 new uniforms issued, 2,000 Glock pistols distributed, and a police force that was, according to the Pentagon's metrics, 65% operationally capable. Samuel Vance, sitting in his office at the Citadel, viewed the Basra Police Service as a reliable proxy shield that would eventually allow for a drawdown of coalition forces. But inside the station, the British intelligence hub near the old port, the thinking soldiers were sensing a rot in the foundation. While the Directorate was measuring the police by the number of patrol cars on the street, the British Special Reconnaissance Element, SRE, was measuring them by the vibe of the precinct. They realized that the machine had built a shell, but the residue of the insurgency had inhabited it. The Al-Basra police force had undergone a lethal metastasis. It was no longer a security service, it was a sanctuary for death squads. To understand the binary failure of the American assessment, you have to understand Arthur, an MI6 officer who had spent 18 months living in the shadow space of the Basra provincial government. Arthur didn't attend official briefings. He didn't read the Directorate's signals intercepts. He practiced the austerity of the relationship. He had recruited a mid-level administrator within the police headquarters, a man who saw the ghosts moving in the hallways every night. In July 2004, Arthur's source delivered the death map. It was a handwritten list of 37 high-ranking police officers who were simultaneously serving as commanders for the Badr organization and the Mahdi army. The report provided the dates of their sectarian induction, the locations of weapons caches hidden inside police stations, and, most terrifyingly, transcripts of meetings where these officers planned the assassination of secular tribal leaders who were cooperating with the British. The intelligence was high fidelity. It revealed that the very men the Americans were training, paying, and arming were using their coalition badges as a license to conduct ethnic cleansing. Arthur shared the death map with Samuel Vance's team. The Directorate's response was a study in institutional denial. This is one man's word against a multi-billion-dollar vetting system, a senior American analyst noted in a cable back to Langley. The Directorate has invested heavily in the biometric integrity of the Basra police. Our sensors show that these officers are reporting for duty, conducting patrols, and maintaining the order. The British assessment is likely a product of their Northern Ireland paranoia. They are seeing steak knives behind every badge. Vance himself dismissed the report. The British lunatics want us to dismantle the only local security we have, based on a vibe. If we fire these men, we trigger a sectarian war. We need to trust the machine's capacity to reform them. But the thinking soldier knows that you cannot reform a predator. The SRE commander in the south decided to launch Operation Nightwatch. If the Directorate wouldn't listen to the human truth, the ghosts would provide the physical proof. For 6 months,
the SRE and a hand-picked squadron from the 22nd SAS conducted surgical surveillance on the Basra police. They didn't watch from the sky, they watched from the gut of the city. They used their Q cars, the modified Opels and Toyotas, to follow police patrols that left the stations at 2 a.m. They saw the reflexive reality of the war. They recorded police Land Rovers pulling up to civilian homes, dragging men into the street, and executing them with coalition-issued weapons. They photographed officers in full uniform meeting with Iranian Quds Force handlers in the date groves south of the city. The species of the SRE was gathering the residue of betrayal. The tension reached its terminal velocity on September 19, 2005. 2 SRE operators, identified in the logs as Thorne and Miller, were conducting a mobile reconnaissance in the Jamiat district. They were in a white Toyota, dressed in local clothing, beards grown to a professional length. They were tracking a specific police commander who was suspected of running a torture cell for the Mahdi army. But the machine of the insurgency had evolved. The sectarian militias had realized that the British ghosts were among them. They had developed their own counter-surveillance law. Thorne and Miller were stopped at a police checkpoint. In the American doctrine, a checkpoint is a safe node. In the urban abyss, it is a kill zone. The officers at the checkpoint weren't looking for bombs.
They were looking for anomalies. They noticed the way Thorne's Toyota sat on its suspension, too heavy for a civilian car. They noticed the acoustic silence of the operators. They didn't ask for ID. They opened fire. Thorne and Miller, practicing the reflexive motor patterns of Hereford, didn't hesitate. They engaged the police with their suppressed 9mm pistols, executing a high-speed J-turn through a wall of fire. But they were braided by 2 other police vehicles. In the 17th second of the engagement, the ghosts were compromised. They were detained and taken, not to a jail, but to the Jamiat police station, the very headquarters Arthur had identified as the heart of the death squads. Inside the JOC at Balad, the machine was in a state of cognitive dissonance. The American sensors showed 2 coalition assets being held by partner forces. The Directorate's analysts were arguing that this was a misunderstanding that could be solved through diplomatic channels. "They are our allies," Samuel Vance reportedly said during the emergency conference call. "We need to talk to the provincial governor. We cannot attack a sovereign police station because of a traffic incident." The British brigadier on the ground, John Lorimer, didn't have time for diplomacy. He was a thinking soldier who understood the vibe of the cellar. He knew that if Thorne and Miller stayed in that station for more than 2 hours, they would be handed over to the Mahdi army and executed on camera. He practiced the Hereford requirement. The man is more important than the system. Lorimer ordered the heavy iron. At 9 p.m., the machine of the British Army, the 1st Battalion, the Staffordshire Regiment, moved against the Jamiat police station. They didn't send a negotiator. They sent 10 warrior-armored fighting vehicles. The scene was an apocalypse of the shield. The big army warriors, 40 tons of steel and fire, roared through the streets of Basra. They didn't stop for the gates. They drove through the perimeter walls of the police station, the bricks crumbling like dry bread under the tracks. The Iraqi police opened fire with RPGs and machine guns. The British responded with surgical suppression. Inside the station, the SAS Snatch Team moved through the dust and the smoke, clearing rooms in the 17-second standard. They found the residue of the Directorate's success. The station was filled with torture racks, execution lists, and Mahdi army flags. Thorne and Miller had already been moved to a safe house nearby, but the British ghosts in the sky
The SRE surveillance teams had tracked the transfer. The rescue mission expanded. The warriors moved to the second location, breaching the house and extracting the two operators just minutes before the militia martyrdom cells arrived. The Jamiat incident was a tectonic shock to the world. The international media reported it as a breakdown of law. The Iraqi government called it a violation of sovereignty. But Samuel Vance sat in his office in Virginia, looking at the photographs from inside the station. He saw the death map Arthur had provided a year earlier, now physically manifest in the files captured from the police commander's desk. He saw the bought assets of the directorate were, in fact, the architects of the massacre. The British Lunatics hadn't been cowboys. They had been the only ones who were close enough to hear the guard shift. The machine had failed because it was programmed to see progress. The thinking soldier had succeeded because he was selected to see the truth. The Jamiat rescue proved a binary law of intelligence. You can buy a man's uniform, but you have to earn his soul. If you don't have the soul, the uniform is just a disguise for the enemy.
The Directorate's Mesopotamia task force was forced to undergo a systemic reset. The full spectrum dominance doctrine was being dismantled by the residue of the reality. The Americans were starting to realize that to win the war in the South, they had to abstain from the money and invest in the species. But the year 2004 was fading into the inferno of 2006. The war was moving from the urban abyss of the police stations to the digital abyss of the global insurgency. The EFP network the British had identified was now claiming 50 American lives a month. The machine was learning, but it was learning in a lake of blood. And in the station at Al-Basra, the ghosts were already prepping for the next walk past. They knew that the shield had melted, and the only thing left was the knife. Part 3 of the Shadow War is the story of the collapse of the Mirage. It is the story of how the thinking soldier used 40 tons of steel to prove that a badge is not a heart. It is the story of why you don't bet against the species of Hereford, because they are the only ones who know that the machine is always the last one to know the war is lost. By the midpoint of 2005, the machine of the American Directorate was no longer merely failing in southern Mesopotamia. It was drowning in its own data. The National Security Agency, NSA, had deployed a multi-billion-dollar electronic tsunami across the region. They had full-spectrum dominance of the airwaves. Every cellular ping, every satellite uplink, and every radio frequency from the border of Iran to the gates of Baghdad was being vacuumed into the digital abyss of Balad. It was a masterpiece of volume-centric surveillance. But in the humid, sewage-choked streets of Al-Basra, the machine encountered a processing horizon. The NSA systems were designed for scale. They could intercept 10,000 conversations simultaneously, but the pipeline required to translate, analyze, and vector that data created a lethal latency. There was a 12 to 24-hour delay between the moment a militia commander pressed send and the moment an analyst in Virginia identified the threat. In the 17th second of an urban ambush, a 24-hour delay is a systemic zero. The British Crown Group, operating with a budget that wouldn't cover the NSA's electricity bill, took a fundamentally different path. They didn't want the tsunami, they wanted the scalpel. They deployed a system known internally as Project Eon. Eon was a tactical signals intelligence platform developed by GCHQ, the Crown's electronic shadow agency, specifically for the urban abyss of Mesopotamia. It wasn't a fixed installation. It was a ghost sensor that could be operated by a two-person team from the back of a beat-up civilian Q car. It was designed to intercept and geolocate mobile communications within a 4-kilometer radius in near real time. But the binary advantage of Eon wasn't just the hardware, it was the reflexive Arabic analysis. GCHQ had developed a proprietary, in-house software that could filter the vibe of a conversation. It didn't just translate words, it identified the sectarian syntax, the subtle linguistic markers that distinguished a merchant from a martyrdom cell commander. Between 2004 and late 2005, the Eon platform was credited with the neutralization of 23 EFP shipments and the disruption of 14 spectacular attacks on coalition forces. A single GCHQ team of 7 analysts sitting in a dusty room in Al-Basra was producing more actionable tactical intelligence than the entire NSA Southern Iraqi collection hub. The directorate in Virginia was not pleased. They viewed Eon as an institutional insult. They believed that capability was a function of quantity. They couldn't accept that a small British team in a Toyota was outperforming a billion-dollar machine. But the electronic vibe was only half the equation. The other half was the institutional ghost. To understand the British advantage in Mesopotamia, you have to look past the gear and into the deep architecture of the crown. The Directorate's institutional memory of the region began, essentially, in 1991. They were tourist intelligence officers, arriving with briefcases of cash and a textbook understanding of tribal dynamics. The British, however, had been inhabiting the region since 1920. They had designed the very borders of the state. They had carved the administrative nodes out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. They understood the tribal leagues, the Al-Malik, the Bani Tamim, and the Al-Kamil Confederation, not as data points on a PowerPoint slide, but as living social organisms they had been navigating for generations. An MI6 officer arriving in Al-Basra in 2003 didn't start from zero. He drew on files, contacts, and familial lore that stretched back 83 years. He didn't need to recruit a tribe. He needed to reactivate a relationship. The difference of the craft was most visible in the marshlands of the East. In November 2004, the coalition needed the cooperation of the Al-Kamil League, a tribal confederation of 100,000 people who controlled the labyrinthine waterways along the Iranian border. This was the EFP corridor. If the Al-Kamil cooperated with the Iranians, the machine would be shredded by molten copper. If they cooperated with the British, the corridor would be closed. Samuel Vance's directorate proposed a transactional engagement. They sent a CIA team to the edge of the marshes with a convoy of armored vehicles and $100,000 in cash. The tribal leaders took the money, smiled for the photographs, and then guided an American patrol into a kill zone 48 hours later. The directorate had bought compliance, but they hadn't earned loyalty. The British reached for the austerity of the relationship. They sent an officer named Ross, a veteran of the secret wars in Oman and the Balkans. Ross didn't take a convoy. He didn't take an armored vest. He went into the marshes alone, in a wooden mashuf boat, guided by a single local contact. He carried no cash. He carried no incentive fund. He brought a vessel of memory. Ross arrived at the reed-built Mudif of the paramount sheikh of the Al-Kamil. He didn't start with a negotiation about weapons. He started with tea. Specifically, a brand of British tea that the sheikh's father had favored when dealing with crown political officers in the 1950s. The meeting lasted 6 hours. They didn't talk about drones or satellites. They talked about the residue of history. Ross referenced specific events: a land dispute in 1958, a medical favor in 1974, that proved the British were not temporary occupiers but ancestral witnesses. He practiced the austerity of trust. By the end of the night, the Sheikh didn't ask for money. He asked for the Crown's intervention in a local water rights dispute with the central government. In exchange, he provided biological sensors, guides and lookouts who would monitor the Iranian smuggling routes 24/7. The operation that followed, Operation Cobalt Tide, was a masterclass in human-centric suppression. Guided by the Al-Kamil tribesmen, a squadron from the 22nd SAS and the SRE moved through the marshes at night, using the silent approach. They didn't need thermal sensors. The tribesmen sensed the vibe of the water. They knew where the mud was too soft and where the Iranian Quds teams liked to hide their caches. The ghosts of Hereford and the kings of the marshes dismantled the smuggling network in 9 days. They seized 47 EFP liners, 300 mortar rounds, and captured 3 Iranian handlers alive. Total coalition casualties? 0. Total cost? £6 of tea. When the after-action report reached the JOC at Balad, the American command was stunned. "How did you get the Al-Kamil to talk?" a Delta liaison asked Ross. "We offered them 100 grand and they tried to kill us." Ross looked at his empty teacup and gave the Hereford answer. "You measured them by your standards. You should have measured them by their fathers." But the machine could not accommodate this human truth. Back at Langley, Samuel Vance was facing a crisis of relevance. The Directorate's Mesopotamia Task Force was being expanded to over 60 officers, yet it was producing fewer high-fidelity reports than the British station, which had never exceeded 23 personnel. The American risk aversion culture, a metastasis born from the intelligence failures of 9/11, had turned their field officers into fortress dwellers. To meet a source, an American officer needed a security detail, a quick reaction force on standby, and a 3-layer approval from the Directorate. The British thinking soldiers operated under devolved authority. A Crown officer in Al-Basra could identify a source on Monday and be sitting in his kitchen on Tuesday. He was trusted to read the vacuum. The assumption was simple. The man on the ground knows the vibe better than the machine in London. This institutional trust produced a cascading advantage. Because the British were intimate with the city, they could feel the build-up to a riot before the first stone was thrown. They could encode the change in the market prices that signaled an imminent militia offensive. In 2004, the fatality rate for British forces in the south was approximately 1/3 of the American rate in Baghdad when adjusted for population. Intelligence was the shield. The eye was the armor. The single most devastating demonstration of this quality gap occurred during the Summer of Fire in 2004. The Badr organization, the most sophisticated Iranian-backed machine in the south, had successfully badged its way into the provincial government. They were the shadow power. The American Directorate was reporting that the local government was broadly cooperative. But Ross and the SRE team had identified a high-threat node inside the governor's office. A mid-level clerk who was secretly the chief of intelligence for the Badr death squads. They didn't buy him. They watched him. They saw him meeting with the architect of the EFP. They saw him signing the execution lists for secular politicians. They saw the residue of the Iranian influence on his very desk. The British shared this human truth with the Directorate. Again, Vance's analysts were skeptical. "One clerk doesn't outweigh our stability metrics," they noted. 6 months later, that clerk
would be the one who authorized the Jamiat checkpoint that captured Thorne and Miller. The machine had been warned. The machine had chosen the mirage of order over the grit of the ghost. As the year 2005 drew to a close, the British Lunatics were the only ones left in the theatre who truly knew what was happening in the grey space. But the machine was preparing its final industrial solution. The surge was coming. The Americans were going to try to win the war through the sheer volume of iron and silicon. And Samuel Vance sat in his office in Arlington, sipping scotch, looking at a cable from the British station. It was an invitation to a joint planning session. He hesitated.
He remembered the Lunatics. He remembered the cowboys. And then he looked at the casualty list from the previous week. Every death was an EFP strike. Every strike was a ghost he hadn't seen coming. He picked up the phone. He didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to unknow the truth, but he was about to ask for the ghosts to save his machine. The geometry of the oracle was complete. The scalpel was ready, and the 17th second of the long war was about to begin. By the summer of 2006, the mirage of dominance that Samuel Vance had carried into Iraq 4 years earlier had been replaced by a heavy dependence on the very lunatics he had tried to banish. The American Directorate's Mesopotamia Task Force was no longer arguing with the British Crown Group. They were subscribing to them. In the multinational Division Southeast, American commanders were routinely bypassing their own intelligence channels to request Crown assessments. They had realized that a 24-hour satellite delay was a suicide note, while a 5-minute vibe check from an SRE operator was a lifesaver. The machine had finally acknowledged the species. In early 2006, the Directorate's own Inspector General produced a classified review of Iraq intelligence operations that would have been the terminal point for any other career. The report, later referenced in Senate Intelligence Committee hearings, contained a passage that acted as a systemic autopsy of the Vance Doctrine. It stated, "In the southern Iraqi theater, Allied intelligence services demonstrated a consistent capability to collect, analyze, and disseminate actionable data at a rate and quality that the Directorate's own elements were unable to match. This disparity was particularly pronounced in human source recruitment and cultural pattern analysis." There it was, in the machine's own cold digital language. The British weren't just lucky, they were better. To understand the final verdict on this disparity, you have to look at the mathematics of the abyss. Between 2003 and 2009, the American Directorate spent approximately $4.4 billion on intelligence operations in the Iraq theater. The British MI6 and Crown Group budget for the same period was estimated at roughly £280 million, approximately $440 million at contemporary rates. The Americans outspent the British by a ratio of 10 to 1. They had twice the personnel. They had the satellites, the Predator drones, and the signals collection arrays that could vacuum every bit of data from the Mesopotamian air. And yet, the product was inverse to the price. The MI6 station in Al-Basra, which never exceeded 23 personnel, produced 214 intelligence reports in a single quarter of 2004 that were rated as high fidelity by the Joint Intelligence Committee. The American Southern Iraq Station, with 60 officers and a small army of contractors, produced fewer than 80 reports in the same period, of which only 60% were rated as reliable by their own analysts. Per officer, the British ghosts were outproducing the American machine by a ratio of 4 to 1. The reason was not a secret, but it was a category error for the Pentagon. It was institutional trust. The American system was built on risk mitigation and linear approval. A CIA officer couldn't buy a local contact a cup of coffee without a security detail and a signed authorization from Langley. They were fortress dwellers, trying to understand a city they were too scared to walk in. The British thinking soldiers operated under devolved authority. The Crown Group trusted the man on the ground to read the vacuum. They knew that if an officer like Caleb or Ross felt the vibe of a street was changing, that intuition was more valuable than a terabyte of signals data. They allowed their operators to go native, to grow the beards, to wear the dish dashes, and to sit in the tea houses for 14 hours a day, soaking in the residue of the city's secrets. The British succeeded because they realized that intelligence is not a data mining operation. It is a human conversation. In late 2006, as the surge began to reshape the war, the American JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, under General Stanley McChrystal, finally began to code switch. They started to dismantle their own loud lethality and adopted the Hereford intimacy. They created the F3EA cycle: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, which was essentially a digital industrial-scale version of the Belfast walk past. They began to value the watcher in the wall. They started to train their own ghosts. The American machine was evolving into a hybrid species, one that had the $55,000 helmet, but also the austerity of the eye. But for Samuel Vance, the evolution came too late. Vance retired from the directorate in 2007. He didn't receive a ceremonial exit. He wasn't given a star on the wall. He left quietly, moving to a house in Arlington, Virginia, where the only thing he managed was a consulting contract for defense firms that didn't work in Iraq. He became a residue of the old Cold War order, a man who had believed in iron when the world was made of shadows. In 2011, at a private dinner for intelligence veterans in Washington, Vance was asked by a former colleague about his original assessment of the British Lunatics. His response was characteristically blunt, but it carried the weight of a declassified soul. "I was wrong," Vance reportedly said, staring into his glass of scotch. "They weren't cowboys. They were the only ones who actually understood that the war wasn't on our screens. It was in the tea houses. We tried to buy the Mesopotamian heart. They just sat and listened to it beat. I measured them by my standards. I should have measured them by their ancestors." This was the final painful lesson of the Iraq intelligence war. Technology is a supplement, but relationships are the only force multiplier that doesn't run out of batteries. The British advantage in Mesopotamia was a product of 83 years of institutional memory. They had been in those marshes since the 1920s. They knew the families, they knew the grudges. They knew that in a tribe, a favor done for a grandfather in 1950 is a deposit of trust that can be withdrawn by a grandson in 2004. The Americans arrived with billions. The British arrived with stories. And in the urban abyss of Al-Basra, the stories proved to be more lethal than the billions. Today, the Special Reconnaissance Element, SRE, is no longer a secret. It is officially the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, SRR. They are the nervous system for the entire British Tier 1 community. They are the ones who stand in the shadows of the markets in Syria, Ukraine, and the Sahel, encoding the environment for the SAS and the SBS. They still use the Belfast walk past. They still use the Q cars. They still practice the austerity of the ghost. But the machine has also caught up. The global special operations community is now a fused web. The Delta operator and the SAS trooper are now part of the same global Tier 1 species. They share the same digital vibe. However, the Hereford standard remains the methodological zero. It is the reminder that when the satellites are jammed, when the drones are shot down, and when the incentive fund is empty, the only thing that matters is the thinking soldier and his ability to sit in the dirt and wait for the truth. Samuel Vance sat in his office in Virginia and told them to get the British ghosts out of the room. The ghosts stayed. They did their jobs. They saved the machine from its own blindness. And then they vaporized back into the shadows of Hereford, leaving nothing behind but the product. The 17th second of the Iraq War is over. The ghosts have returned to the vacuum. But somewhere in the marshes of the South, an old tribal sheik still remembers a British officer who came in a wooden boat, drank tea, and talked about the weather in 1958. He remembers that the ghosts didn't ask for a receipt. They just asked for the truth. And in the world of the thinking soldier, that is the only jackpot that matters. Selection continues. The veil is still in place, and the machine is still trying to see the ghost. Don't ignore the warning. Don't bet against the species, because by the time you hear the click of the 9mm, the 17th second is already ancient history. Who dares wins. The shadows are watching.